Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to chair this event this evening. My name is Narendra Mishra. I'm the Labour MP for Stockport in Greater Manchester. Apologise for starting this meeting on a negative note, but some of you might have seen the reports in BBC and other media outlets regarding the data leak from Xinjiang. This evening we have an excellent lineup of speakers for you, and I hope you leave this meeting with more information and renewed activism for justice for the Uyghur people in China and beyond. Sadly, we're living in a difficult time, and we live in a tech-centric world. But a lot of the tech companies that are being used for CCTV, for mobile phones, for 4G, 5G, all of that stuff, tend to have close associations with the Chinese government. And our speakers are going to cover some of the issues that we've seen that come with them. I am someone who's followed the Xinjiang situation for a long while, but I know for a fact that the outrage that we all feel for what's happening in Xinjiang isn't new. The methods that have been used in Xinjiang have been replicated elsewhere. So Tibet has been under occupation for a long time, and a lot of those people have been forced to adapt to what Beijing wants. We're seeing renewed attacks in Hong Kong and other parts of the world, the debt diplomacy, and all of those things that come with that. I recently learned that more than half of NHS trusts in the UK use CCTV that has links to the Chinese Communist Party, hate vision in particular, and there are lots of campaigns that are running in order to get our NHS, our civil service, our government to stop them from using that. I could say a lot more, but I don't want to steal all the key points of the speakers. So without further delay, our first speaker is Ian Duncan Smith, MP. He doesn't really need an introduction. He's a former leader of the Conservative Party. He's a long-standing activist on this issue. So we will go to Ian first.
Oh, thank you very much. First of all, today is a red letter day in this debate, for the very simple reason that Professor Zenz has yet again, been the initiator of a whole process of documentary evidence which is now out in the public domain about what's going on in Xinjiang. So, first of all, let me start by saying that, and I want to come back to Professor Zenz, just over 2 years ago, at the beginning of 2020, we campaigned, a bunch of us campaigned to stop the government awarding the 5G contract to Huawei, because we said that there were a risk at the time. The government said, well, we think we can manage the risk, and I said, no, you can't manage the risk. And we managed to amend the bill, eventually got the government in quite a lot of issues, and finally they had to accept in the middle of 2020 that they were going to stop any idea of contracting out to Huawei, and that would be the end of it. They'd have to go to others that are not at risk. Now, one of the big issues was they kept complaining as well there's been market failure, and I said, no, you've got to understand there's no market failure over the telecom systems. What's actually happened is China, as a matter of policy, has targeted the telecom systems that were there, the systems providers, on which there were over 15 some 12 years ago, and they're now down to 3 non-Chinese firms that can create a telecom system complete. 2 are in Scandinavia and 1, of course, is in Korea. The rest are all centered in China. And what they've done is that they undercut the whole market to collapse the market. These companies all need to make a profit, otherwise they can't run. One by one they went out of business because there was no money in it. And as we stood up to do this, we found there wasn't even a single whole telecoms company in the United States. So now you get some sense that strategically China knows exactly where it's going. It also understands how we in the West, in the free world, work, and it has targeted our weaknesses. So first of all, that was just an example of how they've operated, strategically, basically collapsing the market so that they then gain all the contracts. And why? Well, Huawei, in the course of this, will be able to harvest data like mad from what's going on, and they will be able to take that back, and they are under obligations under the security law in China to give anything and everything back to the Chinese security services, and they will decide what they want and what they don't want. So the first point is to understand this has been a long-running process with the Chinese government, made even worse, in a sense, with the arrival of President Xi. So we set up an organisation called IPAC, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. The idea I had, actually I worked with Luke de Pulford and others, and the idea is that we would have politicians on the left, politicians on the right, all around the world if we could, all united by one feature, which is their concerns about the abuses that China is undertaking at the moment, at home and abroad. And so we now have 23 countries, from Japan to the United States, all as members of IPAC, and with domestic members as well as that international members. So now we have a balance between parties on the left and right agreed about this, which is really important. So with IPAC, we have worked with Professor Zenz, and Professor Zenz originally came up with some papers last year which showed that the Chinese government was complicit in deliberate forced labour, not just in Xinjiang, but also in Tibet. I think the figure he gave was 250,000 Tibetans were now in forced labour camps. And what they're doing to Tibet at the moment behind closed doors will have to be exposed at some point, because the work they're doing in draining and basically trashing the environment there could mean that the whole of Southeast Asia ends up with a shortage of water in due course, because of the big rivers, as you know, flow from the plateau up in the Himalayas, and if this is worked on badly for them, they could end up with less and less water as time goes by. So this could lead to all sorts of problems, not just from the water, but starvation and everything else. So it's key to understand China's purpose in all of this. So Professor Zenz showed us what was going on. He talked about the very, very high figures of those in of the Uyghur that are actually incarcerated now in labour camps. But these are not, in a day gone by we'd refer to them as concentration camps. They have exactly the same effect. Their target is to eradicate the ethnic grouping of Uyghur from China. It is a Han-Chinese policy. They have been aggressively pursuing this for some time. I'm told now they're even cracking down on those in Inner Mongolia in the north of China as well. Tibet, Xinjiang, North Mongolia, and all groups that disagree with them. So the key thing here is to understand this is a deliberate, focused, and a policy which is part of what China stands for. So we have a real problem. Right now, as we look again, Professor Zenz has produced this second report, which has been brilliantly received. And why? Because, of course, it documents now and shows exactly what is happening now in these camps, which Rahim has said for some time is going on, and people don't want to believe it, but the brutality, the abuse, the treatment of the Uyghur that are taken in there, men incarcerated into forced labour, slave labour, women facing sterilisation, forced sterilisation, abortions and rape, all as a tool of government policy. So today is a red letter day because suddenly the media have picked this up and beginning to understand it. And finally, I just want to end on this. So the plight of the Uyghur is something that all of us should take very careful sense of and do our level best to ensure that we speak about it all the time. I talk to groups all over the place, and I always start with the treatment of the Uyghur. This is a minority whose faith is Islam, but whose attitudes, language and behaviour doesn't coincide with the view of how China should be under, as I said, their idea of what a Chinese citizen should look like, sound like, and what they should do according to the state. So this, in normal times, you'd think would have stirred everybody, but because so much of industry in the free world is now locked in and dependent on China, this has been a huge problem for us. To get businesses to care about their supply chains is a really big deal, and yet they haven't done anything like enough of that at all. And we have now managed finally to get the health department to accept that they will not buy anything where they have any doubts at all about the provenance of that supply chain. There is a company, somebody said, well, how do you manage to test all that? Well, first of all, you should know who the health supplies your goods to as a company. Secondly, I have to say more than that. There is a company called Orotane, as I understand it, that actually has been for years taking samples in all these product areas, looking at the genetic fingerprint. They can actually now tell you not just where that product, if it was cotton, was grown, they can tell you now which factory actually worked it and how much of that cotton came from Xinjiang and how much was blended elsewhere to disguise it. They're now working with the American government. I want the government here to have them working with us. In fact, they should be working, and other companies there are too, with every single government, checking that the government purchases do not contain products that could have been made under slave labour at all. And this is a critical issue for us. So bringing this to task, and I have a simple view that China now is a little bit covered by the terrible invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, but we mustn't lose focus that they are an enormous threat to the way we live our lives and to the nature of what they control. They've taken over the South China Sea. The UN said they were wrong to, the UN has done nothing else. They've trashed the international agreement over Hong Kong, and they're now arresting peaceful democracy campaigners and incarcerating them, torturing them, all the rest. And of course they've cracked down on other religions as well. Christians are being arrested, Falun Gong, all these people. So the last target they have at the moment is Taiwan. And I can tell you now they are planning for that right now. Under the smoke screen of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, President Xi has already instructed his military to be ready, and he's also looking very carefully at the lesson they've learned from Russia. You mustn't be dependent within the banking systems on the free world. So now they're looking to replace all of that dependency, such as it exists, with homegrown devices, so that they will never be in the position that Russia is in when it comes to sanctions, if sanctions are made. This is very worrying. So it's only going to be beaten if people like you, people like all of us, spread the word that this is a problem. You should now question what you buy from China. You should question why you're buying it from China. You should question the companies as to why they have to have everything produced in China and why they don't go to other countries that are democracies and more tolerant and have a sense at least of human rights. This is a big deal. So all I say to you now is the fight has begun. It is a big fight. We mustn't lose sight of it. China has become an abusive and dictatorial threat to the very way that we live our lives. And if we can do one thing immediately is to draw the attention of the world to the plight of the Uyghur, because what they are suffering at the moment is absolute terror. And if we can raise that to public attention to everybody else out there in the streets that watches television but doesn't take interest in politics, then the answer is we will have succeeded. It's time now to take a stand.
Thank you, Ian. Our next speaker is, we will come to a discussion later on. Our next speaker is Raima. Most of you will be familiar with her work. I first came across her, my local council in Stockport did a special event and she spoke at that. So that was a few years ago, and her work and activism on this, and she's spoken on media outlets across the world. Anyway, I won't delay any further. Raima, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for having me today, asking me to speak. I have to update my written speech because of what happened. Been up since 5 this morning. I cannot count how many interviews that I've given since. It's been very emotional for me personally, although I know what has been going on since my last conversation with my brother, that was in January 2017, when I asked him why no one is answering my phone call. He said they did the right thing, it was in God's hand. I know what that meant, and soon after I come across documents that really reveals this mass arrest, start of the mass arrests. And today's photographs we've seen, actually many were taken in 2017 and 2018. Many people, it looks like the first day of their arrest and the photo was taken. And I knew from survivors' story that I have translated dozens of survivors who gave evidence at the Uyghur Tribunal, led by Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, and also the BBC reports on gang rape and various documentaries. So it matches this vivid description by the survivors when they told us about how they were arrested and how they were taken to these camps and how they were treated inside. It's more horror, it's more horrible than prisons. And today we've seen those images and the cruelty and the violence of the regime. And documents reveal security forces were operating a shoot to kill policy, and photographs of thousands of detained Uyghurs. We know that as well. Since 2009, July 5th massacre, we call it, soon after that they implemented the extrajudicial killings and extrajudicial arrests. So anyone that, if they see them as suspicious, the police had a power to shoot. So you can imagine inside these camps, we actually interviewed one survivor today, and we asked him, is there any way anyone wants to escape or any incidents as such happened? And he said everyone wants to escape, but there is no way to escape because simply there are too many cameras everywhere. So the Hikvision, vision, we know the cameras are being used everywhere, all corners of my country. So my country, not only the camps, prisons, but also the streets everywhere. The whole country is biggest prison on earth. So people are too scared to talk to one another, and also the appointed kind of neighborhood committee and people to inform one another. So the situation is, for many people, is unthinkable. And for a lot of people today, it's like a breaking news, but for me, it has been a really living nightmare. I lost contact with my entire family, my 9 siblings, and all my friends since January 2017, 5.5 years now. I don't know what happened to them. I cannot call them because I know that the phone calls are tracked. The landline phones, all Uyghur families' landline phones are connected to the Public Security Bureau and the IGOP integrated joint operation platform collect all the data, every movement, every phone calls you make. Uyghurs have to download a spy app, so without that, if they're stopped on street and they can be taken to concentration camps simply because they didn't download the app that the government can spy on them. So I can, carry on and tell you all these horrors for hours. I've been speaking about the situation since the day I arrived here in 2000. I was unable to return home since, and for the last 5.5 years, I couldn't talk to anyone. But the governments are not really acting. I mean, despite the scale of the abuse, we're calling this genocide. Genocide is happening, and people are taken to 21st high-tech concentration camps in millions. Yet, the UK institutions, corporations, and British taxpayers remain deeply entangled in the crimes being perpetrated against my people. UK public bodies use the same Hikvision cameras that like in every corner of the concentration camps I mentioned. And universities maintain links to professors and institutions in China that are complicit in the discrimination and the persecution of the Uyghur population. and British citizens' pension funds are invested in companies violating Uyghur human rights, and the products of Uyghur forced labor have flooded global markets. So recently we have finally seen some movement on this in the UK. Again, as Ian mentioned, the health minister's decision to rid the NHS of the products of modern slavery was a welcome one. And largely thanks to the tireless work of people in this room. But this is not enough. Even within the health service, there are still links with atrocities such as the Beijing Genomics Institute that need to be rooted out. And other government departments must now follow the suit. Public money should never be spent on the products of genocide. We must rid our supply chains of Uyghur forced labor. The US is leading on this with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And their growing entity list blacklisting hundreds of companies for their complicity in human rights violations. By contrast, the UK has placed sanctions only just 4 officials and 1 entity. And Chen Chuen-kuo, the former party secretary, who was the architect of this genocide, was left out. So the final point of genocide is the destruction of a people. The longer one is allowed to rage, the more likely a community is to disappear. And that means that this is an emergency. Uyghur people are terrified that our language, culture, our future generations will be lost forever. And this government must act now to rid British markets of Uyghur forced labor, dystopian surveillance, dirty money, and unethical investments. I know that British people are repulsed by the violations taking place in my homeland. I can see it every time I go to speak. And the UK should reject complicity because it is what my people deserve, but also because it is in the British interest to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramila. That's quite painful to hear. And I've got 2 siblings who I pretty much speak to on a weekly basis. I'm not sure, how we would cope if we were under the same circumstances that, January 2017, I think you said you have to with 9 siblings. That must be quite painful. Just before I move on, I think the points Raima made regarding the responsibility of the British government, the British state, in order to call this out, but also to tackle the deeply embedded financial system and supply chains is very important. Ian has been campaigning for the last few years and managed to get House of Commons to accept that the situation in Xinjiang is genocide. It meets the requirements to be labelled as genocide. And I think since that happened last year, or the year before? Last year, I think Canadian Parliament and several other assemblies across the world have accepted that as well. We'll come back to that, but our next speaker is John Ludwig. He's a journalist and he writes for several organisations, I think. Byline Times being one of them, and he specialises in human rights. He follows legislation quite closely. And the floor is yours, John.
Hi. So I've spent a lot of time since the pandemic began doing investigative reporting and looking at the UK government's contracts and procurement system. It's incredibly boring, I have to say. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, having to look through the government contracting websites, having to try to make spreadsheets where you take all of the contracts that are to do with the pandemic and put them into a big spreadsheet of your own so that you can analyse them. And I'd like to make some recommendations for how that could be done better. But one thing is very clear: many parts of the public sector rely on Chinese companies and companies that work with the Chinese state procurement. I and other journalists from Byline Times and the Citizens at Investigative Journalism organisation I work with have looked at numerous aspects of the UK's business relationship with China. I've reported on why the majority of the billions of pounds of lateral flow tests the UK bought came from one company, Innova Medical, all of them sourced from China, while British manufacturers were left out in the cold. we've looked at the UK's contracts with Thermo Fisher, a US multinational company which supplied genomics testing equipment to China, which used to conduct genomics surveillance of minority groups, both based in the UK, and international genomics companies that came to do PCR testing, like BGI Genomics, for example. So, you know, genomics is a really, really huge growth area for the UK economy. It's a really important, you know, it holds a lot of potential to, you know, to reduce health problems in future. But, you know, it makes a lot of data. You know, when you go and sequence your DNA at 23andMe or any of these companies, you can find out, you know where your DNA comes from, what kind of health problems you're likely to suffer from. And that creates an absolute ton of data, and it's much easier to sequence DNA than it used to be. Unfortunately, that means that there's a huge, you know, data security problem for anybody who's collecting, who's sequencing and collecting that data. So, you know, there are companies who have been involved in PCR testing that have been criticised for putting in their small print, we reserve the right to, oh, by the way, not just sequence the DNA of the coronavirus if you've got it, but to keep your saliva on record, and maybe we'll use your DNA for research purposes in the future. You know, there's a lot of data security problems like that we are facing as the genomics industry booms. And if we have companies like BGI Genomics involved in our, you know, in our genomic system here, it leaves open the possibility that data could be captured by the Chinese state at some point. One of my colleagues found that the London Policing College, a private training company, has multiple links to Chinese institutions connected to the torture of Uyghurs, and I have seen dozens of contracts awarded to Chinese state companies for the provision of PPE. We found at least 687 million UK COVID-19 contracts going to Chinese government-linked companies. All of this has been facilitated by a number of things. A just-in-time supply chain that's left us vulnerable to supply chain shocks, a lack of investment in manufacturing in the UK, a lack of transparency in the awarding of government contracts, especially under emergency provisions brought in during the pandemic, and of course Brexit, which has forced the government to turn its back on trade with our closest neighbours and allies. I have worked as an external lecturer at a university in London, and I've seen how Chinese students now make up a large proportion of those attending UK universities. Universities make more money from these students than they do from domestic ones, so they can't afford to say no to them or to alienate rich Chinese elites who send their kids here. Again, this is also a natural consequence of, you know, the increasing privatisation of the higher education sector, that they have to turn to these more profitable foreign students, especially Chinese ones. The recent economic shocks caused by the war in Ukraine should also be a warning to the UK. Close ties in important industrial sectors can't be easily unwound when war starts. BP has taken a $25 billion hit on a joint project it was undertaking in Russia with Rosneft, and BP also has interest in China. So we need to really think also more about how we develop you know, the UK's domestic energy sector here, so that we're not relying on these big contracts with regimes that could, you know, we could be in a less friendly situation with, you know, at some point in the future. I think it would also be wise to reflect on the fact that the British Empire abused its trade and military dominance with China in the 19th century, waging two wars to force access to Chinese markets for its opium dealing operation. We should not be naive enough to think that such abuse of an imbalanced trade relationship couldn't also happen to us. This is another reason why the EU has made the UK more vulnerable to economic manipulation, as we are now on our own, no longer part of a much bigger united trading bloc. There's one very obvious policy improvement that could make sure that some companies linked to the repression of minority groups in China aren't allowed to win UK government contracts. We need to reform the Modern Slavery Act 2015, which prohibits trafficking in slave labour by companies in the UK. The bill does almost nothing to stop the use of slave labour abroad, as the Home Office thought that asking businesses to audit and report on modern slavery in their supply chains would be an additional burden. So the problem is not just about prescribing Chinese firms that get contracts in the UK, but also we need to look at international companies that are facilitating Chinese state repression. I'm glad to hear from Duncan Smith that, who said that the NHS is now going to stop buying any products that might possibly have been made in Xinjiang. But I think we need to go further than that and look at companies that have facilitated repression of Uyghur people in Xinjiang. Especially companies like Thermo Fisher, who sold this genomics surveillance equipment to the Chinese state, which was used there, they're still getting lots of contracts from the NHS. And I was looking at the government contracting website earlier today. There was about 6 or 7 contracts with Fisher and companies that are linked to them. I mean, it's a big US multinational, so I understand to some extent why they get a lot of contracts. But again, it's an opportunity for us to develop these industrial sectors in the UK so that we don't have to rely on these firms that have problematic relationships with the Chinese state. As a result of this weakness in our procurement system, we've got companies like the Malaysian medical glove supplier Supermax being awarded contracts even after multiple scandals about their use of slave labour. Their contracts now subject to a judicial review that's partly brought by one of the organisations that I work with. And so, when you've got companies that are, over a number of years, have lots and lots of people reporting that they're using slave labour in their supply chains, and then the NHS is still saying, oh, okay, well, we really need these cheap gloves. Okay, we'll give them another contract. It's just you're storing up problems for yourself at some later date. Bureaucratic problems, financial problems, supply chain problems, so we need to do something about this. Due diligence reports are not part of the information that's required to be published publicly on government contracts, and as a journalist, there's often very little information that you can see about contracts awarded to firms, meaning you have to submit multiple FOI requests to find out. So, if anybody here is working in a public sector body and doesn't want me to submit lots of FOI requests, you've got to get somebody to fulfill. You can just publish the information publicly as open data, and then we wouldn't have this problem. The government has promised to update and standardise data reporting for public contracts, and it needs to make sure this is done in a way that makes scrutiny of where public money goes easier for journalists and researchers to access. Unfortunately, a lack of transparency by the UK government, financial sector and political reporting means Britain has become a haven for corrupt money. And our procurement system is too open to companies which engage in slave labour and provide technology that facilitates the repression of minorities, not just in China, but also in Turkey, Yemen, Saudi, Bahrain and other military allies of the UK. The government has a choice to make. Does it care more about the health of our democratic system and our support for human rights abroad, or does it care more about attracting wealthy international elites and their money, no matter their connections?
Thank you, John. Just one point I wanted to highlight. So, the speakers have talked about Hikvision, which carries out digital surveillance. More than 50% of NHS trusts in the UK use Hikvision. Several government departments use Hikvision. And on the other hand, we have BGI Group, which has received a £10 million NHS contract that is conducting genetic surveillance in Xinjiang, other parts of the world, also receiving NHS contracts. So it's quite a serious issue. Whatever the global position on China, the international financial markets, all of that, the UK government, I think, as cross-party actors, because they should not be using these companies, and we should have much higher terms and obligations when it comes to public contracts.
I can say one thing, which is the Health Department, to a question of mine, is now eradicating Hikvision from all of their areas. I'm hoping every other government department do the same. There's a bit of hesitancy, but
Ian's been relentless. Ian's been relentless on this, and it's very rare as a Labour MP I praise him as ever. Ian's been very good on this, and he's been campaigning on this issue for several years. It's not just a campaign he's picked up recently, so I'm grateful. I believe Nina Navid from Amnesty International is going to replace me in the chair. She's going to lead the discussion and the Q&A element. She's a long-standing campaigner on human rights. She's currently working on the Ukraine project at Amnesty, and we all know what's happening in Ukraine, and that's also quite a serious issue. So Nina, would you like to replace me? And thank you so much. Nina will carry on, and I'll see you all later. Thank you. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Just to say, I work at Amnesty International. I've actually, over the last year... Yes, let me do that. Thank you. My name's Nina from Amnesty, although here chairing in a personal capacity. Over the last year, we work on the case of Nazanin Zavari Ratcliffe and assuring other British nationals who remained detained in Iran. I've just recently moved over, and we'll be working on formulating our response to the Ukraine crisis. And as Ian Duncan pointed out, I think it's worth noting that whilst our response to the Ukraine crisis has been very robust, we can't forget other atrocities like what is going on in Xinjiang. And actually, there's something to be said about us learning to maybe take a leaf from the Ukraine playbook when it comes to dealing with other human rights atrocities. So I'm going to open up for a discussion with the panel. I think maybe given today's kind of explosive data leaks, it might be worth just quickly getting the panel's response to the police file data hack. For those of you who don't know or might have missed what happened today, the Xinjiang police files, we had over 5,000 images taken inside detention facilities or police stations in 2018 and onwards, showing various human rights atrocities. Amnesty has actually made a point of saying that whilst the Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights is in China, there's a really important opportunity to highlight and push in terms of what's going on in Xinjiang. So maybe we'll just quickly get the panel's response to today's leaks.
I wasn't surprised by it at all. It reminded me of, the kind of documentation that you see in some similar kinds of atrocities. It reminded me of toll slaying on the Khmer Rouge. It reminded me of the kinds of documentation you saw at concentration camps and the Holocaust. Some of the pictures were really harrowing, seeing people with tears in their eyes, guards standing behind people, threatening them. I don't know what to say. It's surprising at all. It's getting harder and harder for the Chinese state to deny that this is happening. I don't know how they can look at that kind of evidence and say that we're just re-educating people. But I don't know, where it really leaves us.
Yeah, Professor Zen's is remarkable in many senses. It's the second big data leak that he's managed to engineer with the team. He's working in the States at the moment on this, but he was very good, as I said previously, over the data that he found out from Xinjiang. And the thing he said to me when I was talking to him about it last time, he said, I was astonished at how much they document. It's very extensive. So getting hold of these documents, they're all signed off by officials. So the Chinese government really denies it publicly, but they can't really deny it. It's clear, it's evidenced, and it's absolutely corroborated. The second thing he did, which got pickup but not as big, was that he also managed to get a full global list of what we used to call the wolf warriors, these Chinese security people that spend their time both at home and abroad undermining individuals that disagree with the Chinese government. I've been targeted on a number of occasions by them, false identities, all that sort of thing, and they've attacked our site at IPAC quite regularly. So he's been very good. Today's leak is breathtaking, really, in its scope and its breadth, really. The scale of the documentation is enormous, and this time around they've got photographs as well, which is interesting because that means that they actually quite enjoy what they're doing, to be able to log the photographs as well at the same time, which tells you very much what you need to know about the attitude and mentality of those that are carrying out these abuses. The government, of course, in China will deny it. That's what they do all the time. I think the latest thing they said was fake news. It was engineered by others. But the truth is, the rest of the world believes it now because it's been corroborated. So this is but the start, really. This is the start, the evidential base on which we can demand certain things about China and Chinese products. It's interesting, I think you referenced in your comments the universities. We have a real problem in the UK with universities at the moment because many of them become completely dependent on China. And when we did the other two reports, next to nothing was discussed in open forum by the new British universities. We're talking about Russell Group and Oxbridge, Cambridge and Jesus College. I've had conversations with them. They've received a lot of money, and you find that debates there just don't happen. So free speech on campus needs to be free, and if you're accepting money with prejudice, that is to say you're told in certain terms there are certain things you shouldn't debate, well, it's money that you shouldn't be taking. There's a beginning to the start of that, I think.
Just if I can add this a little bit, having taught Chinese students over the past couple of years, but I have to say also, like, it's not ideal from a teacher's point of view for universities to be encouraged to let in, as many Chinese students as possible, even if their level of English is not necessarily up to the standard that it takes to do a master's degree, because some of my students weren't turning up to the class. I had one student who didn't turn up to the class at all, writing basically Chinese government propaganda in one of his essays, which I failed him for, not because it's Chinese government propaganda, but because it wasn't what he was asked to write. But it doesn't make it nice for a teacher as well. It doesn't make me want to go back there and teach that class again next year.
Great, thank you. Rahima, you already spoke really movingly about the impact of the leaks. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I mean, one way it's distressing to see and be confronted with the truth when you know the truth already. But also, it gave me hope as well, especially this week, because we've been very, very concerned about this High Commissioner's visit without releasing the report, which was ready in September last year, and under Chinese government's pressure. And we know how Chinese government window dressing, all the sins, and we know that this is not unfettered access or investigation, rather it's a visit, accompanied indeed by the Chinese government. Although she mentioned that she will be meeting civil society and so on, but there is no independent civil society exists in China. Since she took power, the first people targeted was human rights lawyers, throughout China, and therefore there is no way she can speak to anyone or independent body or individual who can really openly say anything about China, because they know that in the end she will leave, they will be there, they would be there. Even people in this country, I know Uyghur families who had family members taken inside and died short after release, and they wouldn't come forward to speak about it, because they said that if I do that, they might take my other brothers inside, they might take my other sisters inside. So when you compare tens of thousands of Uyghurs living in exile in Turkey, in Europe, less than 10% of us had courage to speak the truth. Why? Because you can be very brave for yourself, but sometimes you can't be brave because you cannot put your children or your own family at risk because you feel guilty. And therefore, if people even in exile cannot speak the truth, how is it possible for people living in this biggest police state to be able to speak the truth? So we quite concerned about the whitewash. This visit might whitewash the whole thing, and then the report, they might change the content of the report after the visit. But today's leak gave me hope, because no one can deny that. They have to include this in their report, if there is any report to be published. Am I right?
You are. In fact, interesting today, we discovered, you're completely right, the Chinese government has already told the UN that under the rules of COVID, they're not allowed to speak to anybody at all without prior agreement with the Chinese government. And of course they're saying this is a COVID issue, it's nothing to do with COVID at all. It's just the fact that they want to talk to anybody that they haven't already given them permission to do. But I also discovered today, and I just managed to get it in a question to the minister at the dispatch box. I said, we've just discovered that a particular UN human rights worker has received £200,000 from the government of China. Now it begs really belief about the idea that the commissioner can go into China and then people operating to support her have actually taken money from China, and I begin to question the whole purpose of this visit in the first place, when the UN knows very well how difficult China is. And it follows the visit of the WHO to China when COVID started and the whitewash that took place there. China is very good at leaning on these administrations and working them. They took Taiwan out of full reporting. They have to report through China on health matters now. That was all done because China objected to their presence. The result then is we had no idea what was going on in Taiwan during the COVID. So you can see the shape of this, how the big international institutions of the UN start to get very heavily bullied by a Chinese government that isn't short of money and isn't short of determination.
Brilliant. Thank you. I mean, I guess, like you said, at least the mounting evidence will make it much more harder for Beijing authorities to kind of whitewash this visit. So hopefully you've received and we'll hear your message, and let's see what comes out of that. Right, so shifting slightly, obviously the focus of this talk is about designating Chinese entities, so another question for the panel. The UK has sanctioned Huawei for its role in signal collection and is acting against Hikvision. Do we not need a consistent approach based in legislation so that other companies like BGI Group do not slip through the cracks? Would like to start? Yeah.
I mean, I talked about the genomics industry. I think is a really important industry, and like I said, looking through contracts is a really boring thing to do, and I don't think that outside of the health sector that there's a lot of people in the wider society that quite understand how important genomics as an industry is going to become. You know, and it's part of a drive towards big data. It's part of a drive towards you know, algorithmic provision of services which use that big data. And you know, there are lots and lots of companies that are looking at the NHS as a huge store of data and of procurement. You know, that need that data that the NHS produces. Now that there are, you know, Genomics England is starting to roll out postnatal genomic sequencing for newborns, so that we can do, you know, predictive medicine in the future, and that's going to become, you know, a huge way that the government wants to save money in the NHS by, you know, identifying what diseases people are likely to suffer from and basing procurement and manufacture on that. So in that area, I think that there needs to be some joined up thinking about how we protect that data specifically, because it's really important data. That's exactly why the Chinese state wants to do genomic surveillance over minority communities in China. As with the photographing and other documentation of people, detainees in these concentration camps, it's a form of control. They want to be able to understand, you know, they want to be able to say, oh well, somebody's committed a crime, we've got some biometric data on somebody, and we can match it to this massive you know, surveillance system that we've got. It's like, you know, what happened in Kashgar in 2008-9, where they just destroyed the centre of the town and they started to put CCTV cameras everywhere. It's doing that, but on a genetic level, and you know, I think that's something that we should be worried about, and also them potentially being able to get access to genomic data on people in this country, because as well as, you know, being able to do amazing things with genomics and protect people's health, it can also be used for really nefarious purposes. So I think genomics is an area I'd like to see, you know, some kind of white paper, some kind of research work, just to recognise that that's going to become a huge boom area for the economy, and it's also an area that we need to protect from a data security point of view.
Great. Originally, you touched on that point, didn't you, in terms of involvement with the NHS?
I didn't touch on organ harvesting yet. it's also conveniently to target the matching donors. We know from previous reports, and also we have another Uyghur friend of mine who lived in this country, Dr. Anna Tokti, who was involved in this really shocking operation. So therefore, it's quite scary. This is, it's extremely difficult to get the in-person evidence, because when we spoke to ex-police men, they said it is a general knowledge, everyone knows. Once people interned in camps or in prisons, the right to leave, the political right is completely taken away from them. So basically they're in the mercy of the state. So they can make money from forced labor, or they can make money from their organs. They can simply also make money from hair, for example. 13 tons of hair was seized in the US, was it in 2019 or 2020? So this camp situation is not just to destroy people, but also it's aimed to make profit. Aimed to make profit. And this is evil. This profit is not just remain inside the country. This is now many companies, institutions, NHS, they're all tainted and being involuntarily involved. And that's why I think, there's so much that, the governments should do to prevent.
There are a couple of points that might be worth just making to illustrate how we go about it. There is a procurement bill now coming forward. That procurement bill is meant to straighten out all the rules with regards to procurement of in government, on the government estate. It follows actually the Health Department's determination and acceptance, therefore, of an amendment which now stops them taking any buying any goods that are tainted within the supply chain from areas that are believed to be practicing slave labour, forced labour terminology. And the procurement bill, we are pushing to make sure that it actually then widens the scope, so that in actual fact every single government department would then have to make this clear that they're not allowed to. There's been a lot of pushback in the last year about all this stuff from mostly government civil servants who claim that they won't be able to get products at a reasonable level, etc., price level, which I just think is no excuse at all. But there is now the process of change taking place, so that bit has, after all the campaigns, has managed to establish itself in the government, such that the procurement bill itself will have to embody that. The second thing is we forget actually, and you were talking earlier on about genomics. The truth is we have here in the UK a very big potential for medical tech, which would include all of these areas, trials right the way through to genomics. Hugely, because we've got some very, very, very good science bases in some of our universities, and also we have next door, you're quite correct, probably the world's biggest single data, a place of data that exists on health issues, which is the NHS. So the two together, side by side, can actually be transformative, but we have to be very careful on how we protect the use of that data and who's using it. So this is why I wrote a recent report called the Tigger Report, which is about regulatory change. Some was deregulated, but on this area we said we now need to regulate this area and define the market by the regulation. So it's at the moment not regulated and defined, but it will have to be regulated in how the data is used. So the government, I hope, is going to take that forward as well through the procurement bill. So beginning, governments take a while to move, but I think they are beginning to move on this. When we think 2.5 years ago, they didn't accept the idea that you couldn't use a company like Huawei. Now they're talking about not buying from China and co. America's they're ahead of us, I think, on this. Europe actually lags behind us on quite a lot of this at the moment. We've got a lot of members of IPAC in Europe, in the European Parliament, etc., which we work with regularly, and trying to get countries like Germany. And Germany is very heavily dependent on China, massively dependent. Most of their cars, it seems to be now, are actually made in China. They're just assembled over in Germany, so they're very locked in. So it'll be a big issue to try and get some of those countries that are so heavily locked to China to re-evaluate just how much of that work that goes on in their production sites is actually coming from places that are using slave labour or products that came from the use of slave labour. So there's more to do, but we're getting to the wheels, beginning to turn.
Brilliant. One more before we open up to the audience. Do you think the government is doing enough at the moment, or has done enough to deal with Chinese companies implicit in human rights abuses? And maybe, again, Ukraine, the government's response to Ukraine might be something, might be a new precedent there. And I suppose for you, what else is IPAC involved in or doing or has lined up for the next year in terms of this area of work?
Which one do you want to start?
Up to you.
Can I just touch on the first question? The answer is no, not enough, but moving. So just beginning to wake up to the fact there's going to be a new. I have also another organisation I set up called the Centre for Social Justice, and the CSJ was the ones that we put together the paper on modern-day slavery, which eventually fed through to become government legislation here in the UK, which actually was the first country to legislate for it. It needs updating dramatically now because there are real issues about slave labour which were not anticipated quite in that report in the same way that it was. So the government will bring forward another modern-day slavery bill, as it were, and they told us that they would be tightening up on these areas about how they treat with it. So we'll see what comes out, but there's some possibilities there. On the what was the second question again?
What else IPAC is doing?
Oh yeah, IPAC is, we've got a big conference coming up in September in Washington where we will bring all the IPAC co-chairs from all around the world together in Washington with the two Democrat and Republican co-chairs, Menendez, who's chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and Rubio, the two co-chairs in the States, and we'll meet there to discuss further how we put the pressure on over mutual legislation. So we're looking to try and influence each other in each of these countries about how we learn on what one group does and to benefit that as well. So that's the purpose of IPAC. So we've got and we support the Zens throughout all these things as well, and give them some support.
I think that the pandemic had a huge effect on, obviously, on supply chains and procurement in general. And it's in a way, I want to be fair to the government in saying that it was a huge challenge that we were just not really very well set up to cope with. I think there was an expectation that supply chains would just become more globalized, that we could just carry on, expanding the realm of free trade indefinitely. And unfortunately, the sort of liberal Whig view of history has been proved slightly wrong here, and we've gone backwards a little bit in that respect. And so I think that we probably need to prepare ourselves for a world where we need to be resilient to those kind of external shocks. So one of the problems was when the pandemic started, the government issued guidance under the Procurement Act, I think, saying that emergency procurement functions were allowed to be brought in. So that allowed all public bodies to basically award contracts without tender. And that is, to me, that's a huge moral hazard because it means that there's a lot more leeway for things going wrong. Whether that's, if you've got to get, tons and tons of PPE tomorrow, then probably something's going to go wrong. And, I mean, there are so many examples of contracts that I looked at. Like, I looked at a contract which was for a company called Gulf Resources, and I looked at the company's house, and it had 0 assets. So I was like, why has this company got a £28 million PPE contract? And so I did a couple of FOI requests. I found out the contract had never been fulfilled. So I managed to call the guy who was in charge of the company. he said, oh yeah, well I said to the DHSC that I could get X million masks, and they said, okay, here's 7 million quid, go and buy it. And so he had it all lined up on the dock in Beijing or somewhere, Shanghai, and Barclays Bank said, oh, how have we suddenly got 7 million quid? We're going to freeze your accounts. And all the PPEs waiting on the dock in China. And now apparently he's taking the government to court and Barclays Bank to court because something went wrong there. I mean, obviously, if you've got a company that has 0 assets and you suddenly give it £7 million, maybe the bank's going to say, where did you get £7 million from? So, there just weren't the companies available to, and so you had also a lot of probably quite unscrupulous people and a lot of middlemen who made a lot of money saying, I'm going to broker these PPE deals and taking, cuts of millions of pounds from, if you've got contracts worth hundreds of millions of pounds, you've got one guy who knows the people in the factories or who can, connect to the factories in China, that person's going to be taking a huge cut. And so there was a lot of waste. And, if you had to set it all up in advance again and do it better, you could design a better system than that. But that system wasn't in place when the pandemic started. So one of the things I would like to see now is the emergency contracting regulations are still enforced. There are still contracts being awarded under emergency regulations. It's mostly NHS and other health bodies saying, well, everything has been pushed so far back because of the pandemic that it's still an emergency and we still need to award the contracts without tender. And there could be some occasions where that's a legitimate thing to do, but a lot of the time they'll just do that because it's easier to do it, it's quicker, they've got a supplier that they've used before, but corruption can creep in there. And so I think that we need to look at the way that procurement is done in general and how it's reported as well. Because, it's easy to say, well, we need to do this as quickly as possible, but you need some transparency and accountability there because you need to see if things have gone wrong to learn from them. And if you're not reporting contracting procurement stuff correctly, then you can't figure out what's gone wrong and try and fix it. So, I mean, like I said, procurement is such an incredibly boring thing, and I'm really sorry to have to talk about it to everybody. But you really don't want to have to look at this stuff. But it's why, I think from a journalistic point of view, it's why it's an interesting thing to look at, because there's not a lot of other journalists who are doing that, because it's very boring. But at the same time, how do you make this interesting for people to digest, and how do you make recommendations on it that people are going to act on, when it's just such a dull thing to talk about?
This is an important point though, because global markets, the drive to global markets is, I'm afraid, I think, going to stop. And people are going to start defining things by strategic importance now, and that's already going to happen here. But it's going to happen, I think, all over the world. So what you're going to get is people saying security of supply will become critical on this. And so there'll be much, I suspect, which I'm in favour of, there'll be much greater push now to have areas of centres of supply that are much closer to you in geographical terms. And it goes to energy as well. Whatever else going towards green, you're still going to need gas, fuel, etc. So the government's going to have to invest in that, whereas before they didn't think they had to because they could buy from somewhere else. So all these things, I'm afraid, the world is going to change as a result of the Ukraine-Russia because it's tested our global supply chains to destruction, and they have gone to destruction. So we're going to have to think about that again.
One thing I'd really like you to look at, Ian, is to look at the manufacturing of lateral flow tests, because there are British companies that couldn't get their lateral flow tests accredited by Fortin Down, and they don't know why. And I haven't been able to get to the bottom of that. So they
We've shown you the data, I'll ask them.
they really love your thing.
Want to follow up on, so we do have to wrap up at 8:30, so I'm just going to open up to the audience. Q&A.
One very quick question.
Yeah.
What do you think China's ultimate expansionist goal is?
I'm not a China expert, so
well, I think it's very simple. If you are the Chinese government, if you're President Xi, and you put yourself in their position, they've had 250 years of humiliation, really, at the hands of the undeveloped nations. So if you think about it, China, for over 1,000 years, was dominant. They were the middle kingdom, as it were. They were dominant in everything, trade. They were the power, and although regimes change, the power of China was there economically and everything else, sophistication and technology, you know, you look back over it. You get to the sort of 18th century, 17th, 18th century, and then you start to see the dial shift as European nations start moving in. They've taken their technology to new areas of industrialization, etc., the UK, etc., all the Industrial Revolution. So suddenly China is facing countries that have moved on beyond where they were in technology, in warfare, and just about everything else. And so the result is China, bit by bit by bit, gets kind of humiliated, eaten up, broken up, you know, internal strife, etc., the powers of France and Britain, etc. So when you sit where they are, what they're after is restoring, I think, their position as the dominant system in the world, as it were.
Economic.
Economic, militarily, everything, back to where they think they were. It was never quite like they think, but so President Xi, having taken over, has very much firmed up, I think, of that view. He speaks of it quite openly, to be fair to him. He talks about China's role in the world. He talks about China being the dominant economy and the dominant military power. They set the target date for that by 2039 to be both the largest economy in the world with the most potent military. They may not make it on the military front quite to that degree, but they're certainly using their money a lot to develop. And the only country that stands in the way of that is, of course, the USA, with its capacity. So the question really is, the purpose is to dominate and then never again have to think of what the others want to do, because you are the dominant nation. And so, the phrase used quite often is the Middle Kingdom. That is where I think they'll be out. And as I said, the key thing is President Xi, to be fair to him, and I don't like being fair to him, but I will be fair to him, has been utterly open about this. Chinese government's been open. But to do that, he cannot brook dissent. He cannot brook anything else but a very clear hand Chinese policy. So you can see everything fits within that now. You cannot have different languages, linguistics, you cannot have ethnic minorities that are dominating you. You must control everything so that you can then dominate these other spheres. And you can see it with the South China Seas, you can see it with Hong Kong. He doesn't think there's any point in Hong Kong any longer because they've got Shanghai. And the truth is, they still need Hong Kong because of the common law and businesses like being there, but they're taking it to the brink. And then Taiwan. Their big ambition regionally is Taiwan. Taiwan, they want it back. They think it should be theirs, and they are really getting ready to do that. Whether they do it soon or not, I don't know. But so I think that's the motivation for China and the Chinese government, and we need to find a way to counter that, really, which is at first non-military, and that's the important thing. Their Achilles heel, I think, if you want me to be clear about that, I think the Achilles heel of China is they're still incredibly reliant, although we're dependent on them, they're very reliant on us.
Yeah.
And their economy now is stuttering at the moment, so they're not absolutely all conquering at the moment as things might be. So there are lots of ways in which let's take, for example, India. Now, India is I think, the one nation in that area that worries them. Its capacity to, if it gets it right, to become a challenger is enormous. And hence they've clashed with India again and again, militarily, in diplomatic terms, in industrial terms. So we should be looking at India to help. India, I think, is, for all its faults, it's a democracy. It has a independent judiciary. So there are, potentials there that we do. It's got a very high educated population. So we've got to start looking at ways of counterbalancing this in that region, and I think that's important. Sorry, I probably don't want to.
Anyway, did you want to add anything, or?
It's a big question here.
Sorry,
Sorry, we're a bit short on
Okay,
time, so I'm
all
just going to take another one. Yeah?